When setting the exposure on your camera, it's important to understand what you're trying to expose for. Most shots will have multiple objects that will be reflecting or emitting varying amounts of light. In most cases, you won't be able to get the proper exposure for everything, so you'll need to decide which objects to adjust your exposure for. Let's look at an example. In this shot of the warrior Garoon, we pointed the camera at a blank sky. Now, granted it was overcast, but even an overcast sky is much, much brighter than this dude is, especially when there's no direct light source on the front of him. So we could flood him with light to balance out that disparity in brightness. But we didn't want to do that in this case because it would have felt unnatural. As we'll learn later, that's just kind of a weird angle for lighting, and there's nothing really motivating the light from this direction. I think what most cinematographers would do in this case is set their exposure so that the character was properly exposed. For this shot, that would mean making the whole image brighter. That would get us to the proper exposure for the character, but lighting up the image a lot would have also overexposed our sky and blown out all those highlights. Now, for almost all cinematographers, this is a small price to pay because people are the most important thing in almost any shot. But I just have this weird personal thing where I hate blown out highlights in video. Hate it. Blown out highlights are common. They're everywhere, especially when, skies are in the frame. But to me, this just feels so unnatural and distracting. I don't know why. Maybe I was bullied by an overexposed sky when I was a child. I don't know, whatever. So what I tried to do in this shot is something called split exposure, where I split the difference in exposure. I made the character a little too dark and the skies a little too bright. Now, you might argue that I just ended up making everything ugly and the sky didn't really have any detail worth saving anyway. To which I would say, I know, I get it. It's not my best work exposure-wise. The disparity between the bright sky and the underexposed backlit subject is just too much. Usually when doing a split exposure shot, you test the exposure values for the object you want exposed, then use the f-stop value that is the average of the exposure readings. So for example, let's say you had a subject that was exposed at f4 and another person or object that required an f2 to get a proper exposure. Then you could split the difference, which would be an exposure of f2.8, sometimes just called f2.8. Here's a great example of a split exposure shot. We start with the subject properly exposed, and then we pan over to the window, which is much brighter and causes everyone to be backlit. We're not quite exposed for the subject anymore at this angle, but we're also not quite exposed for the bright background, which would have put everyone in silhouette. This is a split exposure because it's a good average exposure for all the complexities happening in this shot. On your sets, you will have to make tough choices about exposure all the time. Sometimes you'll want to split the exposure like this. Other times you might want to be more bold and exaggerate exposure differences by exposing for one object over another. You might even want to subvert expectations by underexposing the subject to create mystery or tension. The point here, again, is to be intentional about your exposure choices. Don't just get enough light for the whole frame and call it good. No, you'll get better results by choosing which objects in your shot to expose for. Next, we'll look at some indispensable tools for determining the exposure in your shots.